Over on my homepage here, I'm just going to search for the address that I would like to travel to within my Uber application. And what you'll see is that our map here will automatically pinpoint the direction from point A to point B. And from here, our homepage has also forecasted a price between an UberX or an Uber XL option. If I would like to, let's say, select the Uber XL option, I can click that and you'll see our button will update accordingly. I can then choose to confirm my booking here, and it's now going to search for a driver within my application. And once the driver accepts this trip, it's going to redirect us through to a page where we can see not only the driver's profile information, but also their average star rating. And if the driver was to send me a message here, it's going to display it within our chat field. We could of course respond if we would like, but in this instance, I'm just going to mark this ride as complete from the driver's end. And now what you'll see is I'm prompted with a pop-up that will encourage me to leave a review for this driver. So I can choose an average star rating here, and if I would like, I could even submit an additional comment on my review. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you how to build your own ride-sharing application like Uber, entirely out of no-code using Bubble. Over 12 months ago, I originally created a tutorial which explained how you could build an Uber clone out of no-code in Bubble's platform. But since this tutorial was published, Bubble has upgraded their whole platform with a brand new responsive engine that leverages the CSS Flexbox framework. So since this big change, I wanted to take the time to recreate my Uber clone tutorial, just to ensure it was up to date with the very latest responsive engine, which will allow you to create a fluid experience across any device like mobile or desktop. I also wanted to add in a whole suite of additional features that I didn't include within my very first tutorial. So I'm super excited to share with you how you can add those into your own Uber application. For those of you who don't know me though, I previously worked with the Bubble team to write their How to Build blog series. This series took a list of the top products out there on the market, like Uber, Airbnb, and Instagram, and explained the step-by-step process to building them with no code using Bubble's very own platform. If you're anything like me though, I personally find it more effective to learn through a video tutorial, as I can follow along with the very specific steps or pause the video along the way. So I wanted to create my own video series that walks you through everything you need to know in order to bring your application to life on Bubble's platform. Of course, I would just like to note that this video series has no affiliation with Bubble at all, and it's something that I'm doing in my own time. Throughout today's tutorial though, we're going to be building our own ride-sharing application like Uber, which will include a whole suite of tools to recreate the real-world product. This will include features like being able to register user accounts, allowing users to store a payment method on their profile, building out a homepage that displays a navigational route on a map when a user determines their pickup and drop-off location, building out the workflows to create a new ride within our application, and of course at the end of that ride we'd also like to create a way to process payments. We're also going to be building out a messaging experience that allows riders and drivers to communicate with each other throughout a trip. And from there, we're going to be creating a rating and review system, as well as a trip history page so riders can see a complete list of all of the previous trips they've taken within our application. Look, there's so much I want to cover throughout this full tutorial, so let's just grab our Bubble editor and we can get started. The very first thing I wanted to cover in our tutorial today isn't actually a core feature that users are going to be engaging with on our platform, but instead I wanted to take the time to set up all of the necessary data types and data fields that are going to be used to power our ride-sharing application. And for the sake of our tutorial today, I've written all of these data types and fields down within a Notion doc here. What I love about Notion is that it allows you to just tick off items along the way, and it's just a great way to keep track of where you are throughout your build. I personally use Notion to store all of my data types and fields, as I mentioned, but I've also gone ahead and stored a list of all of the features that I'm going to be covering throughout this entire course, and I'll be sure to tick those off along the way. Of course, I'll also be sure to provide a link to this Notion doc here, so you can create a duplicate of your own and keep track of where we are throughout the build at the same time as I walk through each of the steps. When it comes to creating a database though, some people can often get a little bit overwhelmed at the whole process. And I remember when I started using Bubble, it definitely did take me a little bit to get my head around. But the most important thing you need to understand is the difference between data types and data fields. So a data type will contain an overarching object that you would like to create, and a data field is any of the information you'd like to store under each data type. So the way I like to approach building a database is that I first like to write down a list of all of the things that users will be creating within our platform. And so you can see here that a user will be creating a user account. So the user is a data type. A user will create a trip or a ride within our application. So that is an overarching data type. A user could create a rating, and a user could create a message that they want to send to a driver or a rider. So these are all things that users can create within an application. So they are our overarching data type. But then when it comes to the data fields, I've just listed out all of the information I'd like to store for every entry with a data type. So for every user that registers an account, I'm going to want to store things like their name, their profile photo, and their profile type. And I'm going to be walking us through the process of how we can actually create these data types and fields within our Bubble database. So over in my Bubble editor here, I've just created a brand new product. And at this point, I'd like to open up our data tab on the left-hand menu here. And what you'll first see is that Bubble has automatically created a user data type by default. And that's because in order for people to use your application, they're of course going to need to register an account. And by default, under our user data type, there will be two created data fields that you will not need to create. The first will be an email. This comes standard with any Bubble user data type. And the other is a password, except you just won't be able to see that in plain text here, just for security reasons. One thing I also would like to point out though is that you may have seen next to our user data type here that Bubble has indicated that we have some privacy rules applied to this data type. And what that just essentially means is that for every user who creates an account within our application, they're only going to be able to see the information that's relative to their own account. And now while that can be useful for some applications, in our tutorial today, we don't want that to be the case because we want users to be able to create things like reviews or even messages that they can send to each other. And because users are going to need to be able to view content that other users have created, we're going to need to start by removing this privacy setting before I then build out all of the additional data types and fields. So we're going to just take the time to quickly click on this privacy rule here. And then I'm going to delete this privacy rule from my user data type. If I head back over to my data types tab here, I also just want to make sure that this checkbox here is not ticked, or else when I create a new data type, it's going to apply the same privacy rules to it. What you'll also see now is that because I've deleted that privacy rule, our user data type is now publicly visible, which is exactly what we want to create. But after this, what I'd like to do now is start adding in all of the different data types and fields that were listed in my Notion doc. And before we start listing out the data fields for our user data type, I'm actually going to want to add in all of my additional data types first, because what you'll soon see is that some of the data fields within each data type link to each other. And so in order to be able to do that, I'm going to need to first build out my data types. So I have 4 data types here. As I mentioned, there is the user, there is a trip, there is a rating and a message. And I'm going to be explaining those as I add them in. So by default, my user data type has been created. The next data type I'd like to create is called a trip. And now this could also be called a ride. So every single time a user requests a trip or a ride, I'm going to create an entry within my database. And then within the data fields of that trip that I'm going to add in a moment, we'll be able to store things like who the driver is, their pickup location, their drop-off location, and any other information we need to know. Following on from that though, the next data type I have is a rating. So this is going to allow users who are riders to submit ratings for those users who are drivers. And so I'm going to call this data type a rating. I'll create that. And then the very last data type I have within my Notion doc here is a message. So when a user requests a trip in our application, I'd like them to be able to exchange messages with the driver of that trip. And so in order to do that, I'm going to have to create a message every single time they would like to send a text-based message. So I'm going to set this data type to be called a message. I will create that. And that's actually all of the data types I'm going to need to create for our application. What you'll find with this particular build is that we're going to be using quite a few data fields to track the process of each trip, as well as the details of each user account. And so we're going to start now by adding in all of the data fields that we'll need to power our user accounts. And I can see that the first data field here is the name of a user. So for every user that registers an account, I'd like to store a name under their account. And this field type is just going to be a text-based field. It's pretty straightforward. At this point, I'm also going to want to register a profile photo for every single user. So I'm going to create a data field for that. And this field type will be an image because I obviously want to store a photo of a user. And then the next field I'd like to create is going to be called the profile type. So this is where I can determine if a user is going to be a rider or a driver. And this field type is just going to be a text field type because I'm going to allow users to choose from a drop-down menu later on in my tutorial that will allow them to store what type of account privileges they would like to have. So I'm going to create this for the time being. And then let's say if a user registers an account as a driver profile type, what I'd like to do is create a way for the admin of this platform to be able to approve or decline these new driver requests. So I'm going to create a new field here and I'm going to call this approved driver. And this field type is going to be a yes/no field type because I'm either going to approve a driver or I'm not going to approve them. I'm going to create that. And then from here, the next field I'd like to create is a way to just store what type of model car a driver user would have. So I'm going to create a new field here and I'm going to call this car model. This will be a text-based field. I'm going to create that there. And then if a user has registered that their account should be listed as a driver, I'd not only like to identify what model car they have, but also what type of car they have. So if you've ever used Uber before, you'll know that you are able to book different vehicle types within the application. So things like an Uber X or an Uber XL if you wanted a car like an SUV. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a new data field here, and this is going to be called vehicle type. And this is just going to allow a user who's registered as a driver to determine what type of vehicle they're actually going to be driving with on our platform. And of course, later on in our application, that's going to be essential to help us pair relevant drivers with certain vehicle types with relevant rider users who are requesting a certain vehicle. And this field type here is just going to be a text field type. But while we're also storing data on the vehicle for a user who is a driver, I'd just like to create another field and call this number plate. So that way I can just list what their number plate is to a user when they book a trip. I'm going to select that this field type should be a text field type. I will create that. And then there's one last field I would like to create here, and that is going to be for our users who actually register as riders, not those who register as drivers. And in that case, I'd like those users who are riders to be able to store some payment details in their account. So that way we can charge their credit card once they've completed a ride. And the way I'll be saving those payment details is through Stripe. So using a Stripe plugin, it will automatically take care of storing all of the user's card details in a secure way. But what I'd like to do is just create a data field on our user data type that just verifies if the user who is a rider, if they have in fact saved a credit card onto their account. And so I'm going to create a new data field here, and I'll be calling this saved payment details. And I will have this field type be a yes or no field type because a user has or hasn't saved their payment details. But what I'd like to do is update the default value of this field to be no, because once a user has created their account, by default, they should not have saved payment details. It's only when they will visit their settings page that they'll have the ability to add in their payment details, in which we can then update the status of this data field to be yes. But just like that, that is all of the data fields I'd like to add within my user data type. So I'm going to jump back into Notion. I'm going to tick off all of those items from my checklist. And then we can move on down to my trip data type here. So if I jump back into Bubble here and open up my trip data type, the first field I'd like to register for any trip that is being created is who the rider is in this trip and who the driver is in this trip. And both of those fields are going to register a user who has created an account within our platform. And so I'm going to create a new field here, and we're going to call the first field a rider. So this is the person who is requesting that an Uber driver comes and picks them up. And this field type here is actually going to be a user, which is going to link back to our existing data type. And this is where you can start to see the power of Bubble's custom databases. What you can do is actually link data fields to separate data types, and then you can reference any additional data fields that are stored within that data type. So for instance, if I have created a trip and I've registered that a user is a rider, I can reference their name or their profile photo at any given time throughout that process. And so I'm going to set this field type to be a user, and I will create that. And as I mentioned, I'd also like to register who the driver of this trip is going to be. And of course, our driver field type is also going to be another user. And now for every trip that is created within our platform, I'd also like to identify what the pickup and drop-off location will be. So I'm going to create a field here, and I'll be calling our first field here the pickup location. And because I'd like this to be a legitimate address, I'm going to set the field type here to be a geographic address. And later on, I'll be explaining how we can integrate this field with Google Maps, so that way we can index and select real-world addresses. I'm going to create this data field there. And then while we're here, I'd also like to create another data field called destination location. And this is yet again going to be another geographic address field type. And then for every trip that's created, I would like to register what type of vehicle a user has requested. So again, this is things like if a user is requesting an Uber X or an Uber XL. So I'm going to create a new field, and this is going to be called vehicle type. I'm going to set this field type to be a text field. And while we're here, I'm going to create another field, and this is going to be called the price, which is pretty self-explanatory. This is just the price of the actual ride itself. And this field will be a number because I'm going to want to be able to perform some calculations on that at a later point in time. I'm going to create this data field here. And then from here, I'm going to add in some additional fields that will just allow us to keep tabs on what the status of this trip is within our ride-sharing application. So let's say a user has requested that they would like to book a ride within our Uber clone. When I create that trip within our database, what I'd like to do first is set a status on this trip to identify that it needs to search for a driver. And the way I can do that is by creating a field here, and I'm going to call this searching for driver, and I'll be setting this field type to be a yes/no type, because I'll obviously be searching for a driver, or I won't be searching for a driver, which by that point it means that I have found a driver who would accept this ride. I'm going to create this field here, And then I'm going to set the default value of this field to be no, because I would like to have control over when I set the searching for driver status to be yes. And of course, when we have found a driver for this trip, we can switch this back to the value of no. But let's say we do find a driver to accept this trip. What I'd like to do is create another field that updates the status of this trip to now be in progress. So I'm going to create another data field here and call this in progress. I'm going to set this field type to once again be a yes, no field. And I'm going to then set the default value of this to be no, because by default a trip should not be in progress. And then let's say a trip has been completed. What I'd like to do is create another data field that just allows us to mark this trip as complete. So I'm going to create a new field here, and I'm going to call this complete. And I'll set the field type here to once again be a yes or no field type. And I'm going to set the default value of this to be no, because I'll obviously want to change that later on when the trip has been marked as complete in our application. But when a trip is marked as complete, I'd also like to store a timestamp of when that occurred. So I'm going to create an additional field here, and I'll be calling this field completion time. And if I was to set the field type here to be a date, I could mark the exact date and time that this trip is marked as complete. I'm going to create that data field there. And then finally, once a ride has been completed, I also just want a way to determine if it has been paid for or not. So I'm going to create an additional data field here, and I'm going to call this paid. And this field type will once again be a yes, no type. I will create that and set the default value of this to be no, because by default, obviously a trip won't be paid for until it's completed. And that is actually all of the data fields I would like to add within my trip data type. So I'm going to check off all of those items from my Notion list here. I'm then going to scroll on down to my rating data type. And this is actually a fairly straightforward data type to create. So essentially, after a trip has been completed within our application, I'd like to enable the riders to leave a rating for the driver of that trip. And so what I'm going to do is head over into my database here. I'm going to open up our rating data type. I'll create a new field. And for every rating that is created within our database, I'd like to publish this against a driver. So I'm going to need to identify who the driver is that this rating belongs to. So I'll call this data field a driver, and then I will set the field type here to be a user. I will create that. And then I'd also like to link this rating to a trip that has taken place. Just so that way, if there is, let's say, a negative review, if I was to link that to a trip, I could see the full details of a trip that's taken place. So I could see its pickup and drop-off location, as well as both who the rider and driver are. And so I'm going to create a field here. And as I mentioned, I want to link this rating to an original trip that's taken place. So I'm going to create a data field called original trip. I'm just going to abbreviate this and call it OG trip. And then for the field type, I want to link this to a trip that's taken place in my database. And then for each rating, I'll obviously want to store a numerical value. So that's going to be the star rating that we publish for this review. And so in order to add that, I'm going to create a field here, and I'll be calling this rating. I'm going to set this field type to be a number. It's nice and simple. I'll create that. And then finally, I'm also going to create one last data field, and I'll be calling this comment. So this will allow the writer to add any additional comments in a text field that they could publish with this rating. And so this field type is just going to be a text field type, as I just mentioned. I will create that. And then if I jump back over into my Notion doc, I can check off that I've finished building out all of the data fields that sit under my rating data type. And then finally, I'm going to just need to build out the data fields under my message. So if I jump back into my bubble editor, I'm going to open up my message data type. And so essentially every single time a trip is created, I'm going to redirect both the driver and a user to a single page where I would like them to be able to interact with each other. So I want them to be able to create and send messages to each other on that page. And so for each message that is created, I would like to link this back to an individual ride within our platform. So if a user books a ride and a driver accepts that ride, I'm going to make sure that the messages that are created are published to the same trip where both of those users are present. And so once again, I'm going to need to link the data field here back to an original trip. So I'm going to create a data field. I'll be calling this OG trip once again. I'm going to set this field type to be a trip, and then later on I can link that to a ride within our platform. And then finally I'm going to create one last data field, and this is going to be the content of the message. So this is just the text that a user can type and send within a message. I'm going to create that data field, and I'm going to then jump back into Notion and check off that I've finished adding in my last data fields there. And as you can see, it's actually never been easier to build your own custom database entirely out of no code within Bubble's platform. As I mentioned, if this seemed a little bit overwhelming for you at the beginning, it's because there is a slight learning curve that comes with being able to create your own custom database from scratch. But like with anything, the more you get to experiment around, the more experience you'll have throughout the process. Now that we've finished configuring our database, we can move along to the list of features that I have set out for us in my Notion doc here. And the first one on my list is building out a user registration page. So of course, when a user would like to sign up for our ride sharing platform, we're going to need to create a way for them to not only register an account, but also store their details within our database. And this one's actually a pretty straightforward process to create. So let's just jump over into our Bubble editor, and I can start walking us through the process. Over in my Bubble editor, I'm going to head over to my page drop-down menu and create a brand new page. I'll be calling this page Register. I will choose to create this. And the very first thing I'm going to do on this page is just update the background color. I'd like this just to be a light shade of gray, just so I can see where it actually sits on my overall Bubble editor here. And then the next thing I'd like to do is upgrade this page to the new Bubble responsive engine. So at the time of recording this tutorial, the responsive engine is still in beta. So if by default your application is set to be the legacy responsive engine, we'll just need to upgrade this. But of course, if you're watching in the future, there will be a point in time where the Flexbox responsive engine will become the default option, so you won't need to upgrade. But of course, for today, I am going to need to upgrade this. So I'm going to select that button. Bubble will then work its magic. And now that my page has upgraded, what we'll see is that we have access to our layout tab here, which will allow us to configure our page dimensions. And the first thing I'll need to do is update the container layout style. So this is the way in which the page will be built. I'm going to be choosing from the column option, just because that allows us to add elements onto the page from top to bottom. Whereas if you were using a row, that would allow you to add items from left to right. And of course, when it comes to most websites or any application, you do in fact want to build your page out from top to bottom. So we're going to be selecting the column option. And then for the page width, we're going to select this to be the mobile size, which what you'll now see is that the overall UI within our builder is 380 pixels in width. And so this will look like a mobile device. And when we start to add the elements onto our page, I'm going to be explaining how we can make all of those elements fully responsive. So regardless of what device or size of browser the user is actually accessing our application through, it's going to be responsive regardless. And now the very first thing I'd like to do on this page is just add a logo at the top, which will just be the Uber logo. So I'm going to head over to my visual elements here. I'm going to choose to add in just an image. And now I have a static image on my local device here, which is just the Uber logo. I'm going to choose to upload this. And then once I've uploaded this static image, I'm going to need to, of course, change the dimensions of it. So if I head over to my layout tab here, the first thing I'd like to do is just update the horizontal alignment of where this image sits in our overall page. I want this to be positioned in the center. And then when it comes to the width of this element, I do want to maintain that this is fixed width, but I'm going to set the width here to be 60 pixels. And then I'm going to click this box here to keep the aspect ratio fixed of this element. So now you'll see, because the aspect ratio is 1:1, it will be a perfect square. And the reason why I've selected that this element should be fixed width is because when the page increases, I don't want the size of this image to increase. I always will want it to be 60 pixels. So that's why I'm going to leave this option selected. One thing I am going to do while we're here is just add in 50 pixels of margin at the very top of this image, just so that way it's not touching the top of our page. And then below this image element, I'd like to add a very first heading at the top of our page. So we're going to head to our visual elements. I'm going to add in a text element. And this text will display the words create an account. And when it comes to the styling of this text, I'm going to make things a little bit easier in our tutorial today. I'm going to head to the style options here and just choose the default H2 dark style heading that Bubble has already created, just because the size and color of this font is relatively similar to a heading that I would like to add. One thing I will do though is just choose to remove this style, and it's going to maintain all of the font size and color, but it's also just going to give me access to align the text within this element to sit in the center. And then of course I'll need to align the actual whole text element within the center of our page. So we'll once again head over to our layout tab here, and for the horizontal alignment of where this text sits on our page, we'll choose to center that in the middle. And then when it comes to the actual size of this element on our page, I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width, and I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, and then the maximum width to be infinite. And now within the new responsive engine, that's how you can create truly responsive elements. So regardless of what size this page is, this text element is going to scale across it. So because the minimum width is set to 0 and there is no maximum width, if a user was to retract or expand the width of this browser, this text element is going to just indefinitely fit the actual size of the page. And the text itself will just maintain its current size, just because under our appearance tab, we have it set at the font size of 22. Whereas things like an image element or a group would expand based on the size of the page, the size of a text element is just going to remain static. I'm also going to head to our minimum height here and set this to be 0. And what you'll find is, because we've selected this option here to fit the height of this element to the content within it, it's automatically going to collapse and just fit nicely around the text that sits within it. I'm also going to head to our margins and add 20 pixels of margin at the top of this element, just so that way it's not touching the image above. And then below this, I'm going to add in a group element that will contain all of our input fields where a user can register their details. So this is things like their name, their email, and their password. So in order to do that, I'm going to head to our containers menu. I'll choose to add a group onto this page. Before I update any of the layout styles though, I'm going to head to the appearance tab here. I'm going to remove the style of this group because I would like to set the background style to be a flat color. I'm going to leave this color as white. I'm then going to update the roundness of the borders here to be 10, just so that way there's some small curved edges around each corner of this group. And then when it comes to the actual layout style of this group, I'm going to jump over to our layout tab. And now for the elements within this group, I'm going to be stacking these from top to bottom once again. So I'll need to set the container layout of this group to be a column. I would then also like this group to be centered within our page. And what I'd like to do is make this group fully responsive. So regardless of how small or large this page becomes, I want this group to be able to potentially expand to that size. So I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width. I'm going to set a minimum width of 0 And at this time being, I could set a maximum width of infinite, which just means if I head over to my responsive tab, what you'll see is this group will remain responsive regardless of the actual page width itself. But what I would like to do is just ensure that this group doesn't actually touch the borders of the page. So what I could do is scroll on down to the margins here, and I might actually start by adding just 10 pixels of margin at the top, just so it spaces it out from the heading that sits above it. But if I was to also add 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels on the right, what you'll now see is that this group will expand to be the full width of the page, but it will always leave 20 pixels of margin on each side. So that just means regardless of the size of the page, it's not going to touch the borders itself. And now for the height of this group element, I'm just going to leave this at 250 for now, because I'm just going to start adding in all of the elements that are going to sit within this group. I will most likely need to come back and also update the height of this if I need to expand it down. But we're just going to start adding in our visual elements for the time being. So the first thing I'm going to do is just add in a text element within our group. And this is just going to display the word name, because below this I'm going to have an input field which will allow a user to register the name for their account. And now when it comes to the formatting of this text element, I'm just going to open up our rich text editor here. I'm going to highlight this text and choose to bold the formatting of it, just so that way it does actually look like a heading. I do want this text to be positioned in the left-hand side of this element, so I'm not going to be changing the style here. If I was to jump to my layout tab though, what I'd like to do is unselect that this text element should be fixed width, because I want the element to expand across my group that it sits within. I could then set the minimum width to be 0 and the maximum width to be infinite, which of course just means it's going to scale up or down regardless of the width of the group it sits within. I do want to set the minimum height here to be 0, and of course I'll be selecting this option here to fit the height of this element to the content within it, so that way it just sits nicely around the text element itself. But of course I don't want this text element to be touching the borders of the white group it sits within, so I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin at the top and 10 on the left, as well as 10 on the right. And so what this is going to ensure is that regardless of the width of this element, it will never just touch the borders of the white group it sits within there. So now the position looks more intentional. Below this text element though, I'm going to add in our first input field. So if I scroll on down to our input forms, I'm going to choose to add this in. I'll be updating the name of this to be called input name. And in doing that, it's just going to make this input field easier to reference when we create our workflow. When it comes to the layout style of this input field though, I'm going to of course unselect that this element is fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite, so that way it will always scale across our page based on the size of the browser that a user is accessing our application through. I am going to leave this height as fixed though, just because 45 pixels is the standard height for an input element. The one change I will need to make though is just with the margins. I'm going to add 10 pixels of margin on the left and 10 on the right, and that will once again just ensure that it does not touch the borders of our white group that it sits within. And that's all I'll need to edit when it comes to the layout settings of this input field. And what I love about the new responsive engine is that in order to create another input field, we can just select both our heading as well as the first input field. We can copy these and paste in another version. And then if I was to just select the second heading here, you can choose to reposition this within the layout tab. I'm just going to move this down to the next position here. And I'm going to update this text element to display the word email. And then when it comes to the input field, the only thing I need to change is first of all the name of this input field. I'm going to have this be called input email. And then I'll also need to update the content format to be an email. And that way Bubble will just be able to validate that the format of text added within this field should be structured as a legitimate email address. And then from here, I'm going to once again select our heading as well as the input field. I'm going to make a copy of that. I'm going to head to my layout tab on my third heading there. I'm going to move that down to the next position. And now I'm going to have this heading display the word password. Because of course within this field, I would like to register a user's password. So for the input here, I'm going to be calling this input password. And for the content format, I will need to select that this is a password, which just means that Bubble is going to hide all of the characters that sit within this field. And then from here, there's one last field I would like to add in, and that is just the profile type of the person that's registering an account. So are they going to be a rider or a driver? And before I add that in, I'm just going to need to expand the height of my group here. So I'm going to select on the white group. I'm going to jump to our layout tab. And because I have the option here selected to fit the height of this element to the content within it, I'm just going to set the minimum height of this group to be 0. And now it will collapse to whatever height is required in order to add in all of our input fields. Which means if I was to select our heading here and just make a copy of just the heading, not the second input field here, and if I was to move this to the next position, what you'll see is our group will continually expand down to fit that within it. I'm just going to jump to our appearance tab here when it comes to our heading, and I'm going to have this display the word profile type. And then I'm going to need to add in a drop-down menu, which will allow a user to determine what type of account they would like to register. So will they be a rider or will they be a driver? And so if I head to our input fields, I'm going to add in a drop-down menu within our group. It's automatically going to be positioned at the bottom. And I'll be updating this to be called drop-down profile type. And then I'm going to leave this as a list of static options, and I'll be typing those in manually. So there'll be one option called a rider and the other option called a driver. You can of course call these whatever you would like, but I'll be showing you in a moment how we can store these values within our database. And then when it comes to the layout style of this drop-down menu, I'm going to jump over to our layout tab here. I'm going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and also have a maximum width of infinite. So of course this is now going to expand out regardless of the size of our page. I will leave the height of this to be fixed just because once again 45 pixels in height is a suitable size for this drop down menu. Finally though, I'm just going to add 10 pixels of margin on the left and 10 on the right, just so it sits the same formatting as the previous input fields above it. And then finally from here, I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin at the bottom of this field, just so it adds some space before the group closes off. And from here, the very last element I'll need to add onto the page is just a button, which will be used to trigger a workflow. And on this button, I'm just going to have this display the word register. I'm going to just edit the style of this just to make the color of this button black so it suits the same branding as the real world Uber product. So if I head to the style, I'm going to edit that. I'm going to select the color of this to be black. And that's all I'll need to change. I'll jump back over into my design tab here, and then I can just update the layout of this button on my page. So if I head to the layout tab, I'd like this button to be centered horizontally in my page. I do want this button to be fixed width, just because I don't want it to become any bigger than it currently is. And I'll also leave the height at 45. The only thing I will do is just add 20 pixels of margin at the top and 20 pixels of margin at the bottom. And from here, what we can do is now build out the workflow that runs every single time this button is clicked. So if we choose to start edit a workflow when our register button is clicked, the first thing I'd like to do is choose to sign a user up within our application. And what you'll notice is that by default, you'll be required to register both an email and a password for every single user. Because of course, when a user logs into your application, that is the information you'll need to verify who that user is. So under the email here, I'd like this of course to be the value of the input email field on our page. And then for our password, I want this to be the value of the input password field on our page. And what I love about Bubble is that you also have the ability to update any additional information you'd like to store within this user's account. So if we choose to change another field here, The first field I'd like to change is also the name of the user. I want this to equal the same value as the input name field on our page. And then finally, the other field I'd like to register is the profile type for this user. So the profile type will equal the same value as the drop-down profile type on our page, just so we can register if this user is going to be a rider or a driver. And now before we take a preview at what this page looks like within our application, there is one last thing I'd like to add within this workflow, and that is just a redirect event. So if a user was to come to our registration page, choose to register an account, that workflow would run and it would be successful. But as it currently stands, they would just remain on this page, so there wouldn't be any way to verify that their account has in fact been created. So what I'd like to do is create a settings page within my application, and then what I'd like to do is redirect a user through to their settings page once they have registered an account. And that of course will prompt them to update and store any other additional information they'd like within their account. So what we're going to do is head over to our page drop-down menu here. We're going to choose to create a settings page. I will create this within our application. And then I'm going to jump back into my registration page, open up our workflow editor, choose to open the previous workflow that we had created. I'd like to add an additional step, and I'm going to choose from a navigation event, and I'll be selecting to send the user to a page. The destination page will be our settings page, and for the time being, we won't need to send any data through to this page. I'll be explaining when we'll be required to do that at a later point in our tutorial. But that's everything I'd like to cover for the workflow of our registration page. One quick thing I would like to point out, and this is entirely up to how you'd like to build your application, is that if I was to preview our registration page within our Bubble development environment here, what you'll see is that because we hadn't set a maximum width on our white group on the page, it is in fact fully responsive. So because I'm viewing this within a browser, this group is going to horizontally stretch across the full width of this page. Whereas if I was to then reduce the width of this page, what you'll see is that because this is fully responsive, it's going to scale this page down accordingly. And if I just add in a preview of what this page looks like on a mobile device here, what you'll see is that it actually does look quite good on a mobile device. But if you were creating an application where users could register both on mobile or desktop, you may not want this group on the page to be indefinitely responsive. And so a quick way to fix this is by jumping over into our Bubble editor here, double clicking on our white group and heading to the layout tab. And so the reason this group is continually responsive is because we have a minimum width set to 0 and a maximum width of infinite. If we were to just add a maximum width of 380, which if you remember is the current page width that we're viewing our application on here, that just means that regardless of the page size, this group will be no larger than 380 pixels in width. And so if I was to jump back over into my Bubble preview here and refresh the page, what you'll now see is that this group is positioned within the very center of our page. And it's at this point that I would like to register my first account within the application. I'm just going to call myself test user. And then for the email, I'm just going to say my email is test1@gmail.com. I'll add in a generic password. And for my profile type, I'm going to set myself to be a rider. I'm then going to choose to register my account here. That workflow is going to run, and as you'll see, it's now redirected us through to our settings page within our Bubble application, which of course at this point in time is blank as we hadn't added any elements onto it. But that is everything that I wanted to cover when it comes to registering a user's account. So I'm going to jump back into my Notion doc and check off that we've finished building out that feature. After building out our user registration page, the next feature that I want to cover is building out our settings page. And now there's quite a bit involved within this particular module of this course. So I'm going to try and explain everything in as much detail as I can. But of course, if you find yourself getting lost at any point in time, I'd recommend just pausing the tutorial and rewatching any section just so you can completely understand each little feature before we move on to the next stage in our build. But for the time being, we're going to jump over into our bubble editor to get started here. And if you remember, within our application, we had created a page called settings. And at this point, our settings page will be blank. And what we'll first need to do is upgrade this to the new responsive engine. So I'm going to select this button here and do that. And once we've upgraded this page to the new Flexbox responsive engine, I'm going to head to my background color here and just update this to be a light shade of gray. Once again, the only reason I'm doing this is so I can see where the page dimensions sit on my overall bubble canvas here. Of course, when you publish your application, you can just make this page white if you would like. And then while we're also working on this page, I'm going to head to the Layout tab. I'm going to set the container layout style to be a column because I'll be building this page from top to bottom. And then I'm going to set the preset page width to be a mobile device, which is 380 pixels within our UI builder. Of course, we're also going to be making any elements that we add onto this page completely responsive throughout this process. But the very first thing I'd like to do on this page is just to add in a text element here, which is going to display the words account settings. I'm going to then update the style of this to be the default H2 dark style heading that Bubble has provided. I'm then going to just remove the style because I just want to make one small change to the configurations here. And that is that I would like to center the text within the actual text element itself. I'm then going to jump to our Layout tab and choose to align this horizontally in the center of our overall page. I'm going to unselect that this element should have a fixed width. And I'm going to set the minimum width of this to also be 0. So that way now this element is completely responsive regardless of the width of the user's browser. I'm then going to set the minimum height of this to be 0 and ensure that I've selected this option here to fit the height of this element to the content that sits within it. So now it has collapsed around our text element perfectly there. And then finally, I'm just going to add 30 pixels of margin at the top of this text element, so that way it doesn't sit at the very top of our page. And now within our settings page, I'm going to need to create two entirely different experiences. One that will cater to those users who are registered as riders, and another that will cater to users who are registered as drivers. So when it comes to our riders, I just like to create a way for them to not only update their account details, but also add a payment method on file. And then when it comes to those who are registered as drivers, I would like them to be able to add in the details of their vehicle that they're choosing to drive with. And this is where I can create two separate experiences. So I'm going to start by adding in the experience for our riders to begin with. So if I head to our containers here, I'm going to choose to add a group element onto our page. And we're going to be calling this group rider. I'm then going to head to our Appearance tab and just choose to remove the style of this group because I'm going to want to update the background here to be a flat color, and I'll be setting the color of this to be white. I'm then going to set the roundness of the borders on this group to be 10, just so it has some curved edges. And then for the layout style of this group, I'm going to set the container layout to be a column because I'll be stacking elements in this from top to bottom. I will then also update the horizontal alignment of this group. So that's the position of this group on our page. I'll always want that to be in the center of our group. I'm then going to unselect that this element should be fixed width. I'll set the minimum width of this group to be 0. But because we are building our application for a mobile device, I will set the maximum width to be 380. Just so that way if a user is viewing this on a desktop device, this group will not expand out to the full width of the page. And then when it comes to the margins of this group, I'm going to set a top margin of 20, a left margin of 20, and then also a right margin of 20. And that'll just ensure that regardless of the size of our page here, our group will never touch the borders. So because I've set the max width of 380, this group will expand out to be 380 pixels. But if the overall page is 380 pixels, because I've set a minimum width of 0, this group is just going to retract in order to add 20 pixels of margin on each side. So that would make the size of this group 340 pixels. And now before I change the height of this group and set the minimum height to be 0, I'm just going to need to add an element within it. And the first thing I'd like to do is create an input field that allows us to register a profile photo for this user. So I'm going to add in a text element, and I'm going to type in the words profile photo. I will open up our rich text editor, highlight this text, and choose to bold the formatting of it. If I then jump into my layout tab here, I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite, and then for the height, I'll set the minimum height to be 0, so that way it collapses around the actual text element itself. And that is, of course, because I have selected this option here to fit the element's height to the content within it. And then I'm just going to add 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right, just to ensure that this text element here will never touch the borders of my group. And this, of course, is very similar to our user registration page that we had previously built out. So it's not like you have to learn a completely different process while we build out our account settings page here. The next thing I'd like to do is add in a picture uploader though. So I'm going to head to our input forms. I'm going to choose to add in a picture uploader element, and I'll be calling this picture uploader rider. And so this will be used to register the profile photos of those users who are listed as riders. I'm going to be adding a separate one on our page for those users who are drivers. But when it comes to creating the workflows, I obviously want to be able to tell both of those elements apart. So I'm just going to be ensuring that I add the right naming conventions to the right input field. I'm then going to head to our appearance tab here, and I'm going to just remove the style of our picture uploader, because when it comes to the roundness of this, I would like it to be 100, so it's a perfect circle. I would also like to add in some dynamic content into this element. So let's say a user has created an account and then they've taken the time to upload a custom profile photo. At that point in time, because we have a value stored in our database, I would like to actually display that user's profile photo. And so for the dynamic image here, I'm going to insert dynamic data from our database and display the current user, their profile photo, which will be stored in our database. And then I'm going to choose the processed with ImgX option, which just allows me to tick this option here to resize the dimensions of this image by cropping them. So that just means it's going to expand whatever image out and stretch it to the full width of this picture uploader element here. And then when it comes to the layout style of our picture uploader, I'm going to update the width of this element to be 100 pixels and the height to also be 100 pixels. And I'm going to leave this ticked as fixed width, just because I don't want this element to scale up as the page expands. I will always want this to remain 100 pixels in height and width. The other thing I'd like to do though is just add 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right, just so it's in line with the text element above it there. From here though, I'm going to select my text element here. I'm going to make a copy of it. And then under my layout tab, I'm just going to move this to the next position within our group. And within our group here, I'm just going to be adding an input field that allows a user to update the name stored within their account. So I'm just going to update the text here to display the word name. Because I've copied it from the text element above, I don't need to change any of the responsive settings. They've just copied across. What I will need to do though is head to my input forms here, choose to add in an input field, and this input field will be called input rider name. And then under the initial content field, I would like to display the saved value of the user's name within our database. Because when a user creates an account, of course, one of the fields we were registering was their name. So I'd like to automatically display that within this field. So I'm going to insert dynamic data and display the current user's saved name within our database. And then from here, I just need to update the layout settings of this. So I'm going to head to our layout tab. I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite. I will leave this element's height fixed just because I always want this to be 45 pixels in height. The only thing I will need to do though is just add in 10 pixels of margin to the left and 10 on the right. I'm not going to add any at the top of this element here, just because I want this to be placed up against the title that sits above it there. Unlike our profile photo, I just kept a little bit of space there. And so for our users who are registered as riders, these are essentially the only two fields that I'd like them to change within our database. So what I'm going to do is add in a button element below this that just allows a workflow to run in our database that will update any information that's changed within these fields. Before I do that though, what I'm going to do is select on our overall white group here, and I'm going to head to the layout tab. And for the minimum height of this element, I'm now going to set this as 0, and I'm going to make sure I've selected the option to fit the height of this element to the content within it. And now this just means that the group itself will dynamically scale to be the necessary height it should be to fit all of these elements within it. And if I scroll on up to my visual elements, I'm going to add a button element into our group here. And this button will display the word Save Details. I'm going to head to my layout menu here and choose to center this within the center of my group. And then I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin at the top, 20 pixels on the bottom, and I'm happy with all of the default settings for our height and our width of this element. But what I'd like to do from here is just create a workflow that runs every single time this button is clicked. And what I'd like to do is just update the value stored in our database for this user who is registered as a rider. And so I'm going to head to my Appearance tab here. I'm going to start a workflow every single time this button is clicked. And within our workflow here, I'm going to head to our Data tab, and I'm going to choose the action that's called Make Changes to a Thing. Because the thing I would like to change is the current user. So that is the person who's logged into their settings page and has just chosen to update their information. So that could be their profile photo or their name. And so I'm going to select to change the field in our database for the profile photo. I want this to equal the value of the picture uploader rider, its value. And then I'd also like to change the name field, and I would like the name field in our database to equal the same value as the input rider name field in our group. And if a user, let's say, updates their profile photo but not their name, it's just going to store the same consistent value at all times. So if no changes are made to their name, it's going to make sure that value remains the same. But let's say a user has successfully updated their details. What I'd like to do is just prompt them that that data has successfully been updated in our database. And the way I can do that is by displaying an alert message. So if I head to my visual elements here, you'll see an element called an alert. I'm just going to click anywhere on my page to add this. And an alert essentially just allows you to temporarily display a message to a user. And in this case, I'm just going to update the text within this alert to just display the word updated. And then I'm going to tick this option here to position the alert at the top of our page. And then if I head to the layout tab here, and then what I'm going to do is unselect that this element should be fixed width. And it currently at the moment has a max width of infinite, meaning it's going to stretch across the entirety of our page. Whereas what I'd like to do is just set a maximum width of 380 pixels. So that way it is the same dimensions of our page on a mobile device. Of course, if you're building your application for a desktop, you could leave the maximum width to be infinite because it would need to scale across a larger browser width. What I am also going to do though is just set the minimum width to be 0, so that way it is fully responsive. And regardless of how small this page is scaled down, it's going to scale with it. And now, as I mentioned, an alert message will only display temporarily on your page. And in order to display that, you'll need to add a step within your workflow editor. So if we jump back into our workflow tab here, after the user's details have been changed within our database, I'd like to add an additional step within our workflow. And if I scroll on down to the element actions choice here, you'll see there is a workflow step to show an alert message. And by default, because we only have one alert message on the page, it's going to display that. If you would like, you can customize the fade in, hold, or fade out duration of this element but I'm just going to leave these as the default settings for now. If I jump back into my design tab though, there is just one last setting I would like to change within my rider group here. And that is that I need to create a way for them to add a payment method onto their account. So I would like to store a credit card on file, so that way when they later on decide to pay for a Uber ride, we are able to successfully charge them. And so I'm going to break this down into a separate section of our group. And in order to do that, I'm going to start by copying our title element here. I'm just going to move this down to the bottom of our group. And I'm going to update the appearance of this to display the words payment method. And then I'm going to copy this text once again. And then I'm going to remove all of this text. And then I'm going to replace it with the words a payment method is required. And I'm going to open up our rich text editor. And instead of making this text bold, I'm just going to make it italics, just so it looks a little different from the text heading above it there. And then what I'd like to do is just add in another button element into our group. And I'll have this button display the word add card. I'm going to jump over to our layout tab here and center this within our group. I'm also going to add 20 pixels of margin at the top of this and 20 pixels of margin at the bottom. And now what we'll need to do is create a workflow that triggers a Stripe event to run that just allows a user to store a credit card using Stripe's free plugin. And then later on, when a user pays for a trip, we can reference the credit card details stored within Stripe to actually process that transaction. And so in order to create that workflow event, the first thing we'll need to do is install the free Stripe plugin. So if we jump over to our plugins tab here, we're going to need to open up our plugin library. And then I'm going to type in the word Stripe. And then I'll be installing the very first Stripe plugin here, which is the plugin built by Bubble. I'm going to choose to install that within my application. I can then close the plugin library. And the first thing I'd like to point out is that I'd like to update the version of the plugin that we use within our application. So here you can see the option for the Stripe checkout version. Instead of this being the V2 version, I want this to be the new version, which is the V3 option. And then from here, what you'll need to do is configure your Stripe API keys. Now, I won't be covering this in a whole lot of depth, but essentially what you'll need to do is just create a brand new Stripe account. And then on the homepage, once you've created an account, you'll see the option to copy across both your publishable and secret API keys. That's all you'll need to do. But what I'd like to do from here is jump over into my design tab and click on the button that allows a user to add a card. And then from here, I'd like to open up my workflow editor. And then within this workflow, I'm going to head to the payment actions. And I'm going to select from the second option here, which allows us to collect the user's credit card information. And essentially what that's going to do is actually redirect the user through to a Stripe page where they can then add in their credit card information. And then once they choose to save those details in Stripe, it's going to automatically redirect them back to our settings page here. And then it's automatically going to store the user's Stripe card details with their Bubble account based on the cookie that is placed for this user in Bubble. So you don't need to worry about actually storing the user's credit card details within your database, which is great because you don't have to worry about any security issues that come with that. But essentially, after a user has stored their credit card details with Stripe, what I'd like to do is just display a success alert message that just lets the user know that we have successfully stored their card details. So I'm going to add an additional step within our workflow here. I'm going to head to our element actions option, and once again, I'll be choosing to show an alert message. And I'm happy to just display the alert message which we had previously added before. If you'd like to take the time, you could add in a separate alert message which just says something about like the credit card being stored. But I'm just happy to display the alert that displayed the text updated. The only other thing I'd like to do is just update a field in our database which we had created in our first module. And that field just allowed us to recognize if the user has stored a payment method within their account. So if I head to the next step within my workflow, I'm going to select from the Data tab. I'm going to choose to make changes to a thing. And the thing I'd like to change is the current user. The field for this user I would like to change is the saved payment details field, which if you remember was stored as a yes/no field type with a default value of no. So by default, a user hadn't saved any payment details. It's at this point in time now where I want to update this field to be yes, because we have in fact now stored their payment information. And the reason why I'd actually added this field in is because if I jump over to my design tab, I can now create a condition that recognizes if the current user's payment details have been saved. I'd like to update the text that's displayed here. So instead of displaying the words "a payment method is required," I could display some text that just registers that a payment method has already been added. So I'm going to select our text here and choose to create a condition. Within this condition, I'm going to recognize when the current user's saved payment details status is now yes. I'm going to update the text of this, and I will update this text to display the words "your payment method has been saved." And I'm going to open up our rich text editor, highlight this text, and choose to make this italics. And what I love about Bubble's conditions is that you can choose to toggle these on and off, so that way you can see what this text looks like once this condition is true. And then what I'm going to do is create an additional condition on our button here. So instead of displaying the word "add card," I could display some text like "update card." So I'm going to define a condition and just recognize when the current user, their saved payment details is now yes. I'm going to update the text displayed within this button, and I'm going to have this display the words "update card." And of course I could choose to toggle this on and off if I would like to preview what that would look like. And that is how we can create the fields in order to store the details of a rider within our application. There is one very last thing I'd like to do to our overall group here, and that is just create a condition on this group that only allows these particular fields to be displayed to users who are registered as riders. Because of course I'm going to be creating a separate group for those users registered as drivers, and so I don't want these fields to be displayed to those users. And so if I head to my layout tab here, I'm going to start by unselecting that this element is visible on page load. I'm also going to choose to collapse this element's height when it's hidden, meaning when this group isn't visible, if I was to have a group that sits below this, it's going to move up and take its place. I'm then going to head to my conditional tab here and define a new condition. And I'm just going to recognize when the current user, when their profile type is, and then I'm going to type in the word rider. And now one thing I'd like to note is that the spelling of this will need to be the exact same as the spelling you used on your registration page. So underneath the drop-down menu here that registers the user's profile type, I'd recommend just copying across the text that's displayed as a rider, because one thing I'd like to point out is that I've used a capitalized R at the beginning of this word. And in my settings page here, if I then head to my elements tree and choose to display this group by selecting on the eye icon, if let's say for instance under my condition I hadn't put a capital R here, those values aren't going to be the same, meaning this condition would not be true. So you just need to be cautious of the free text that you add within that condition there. What I'd like to do though is just recognize when the current user is registered as a rider, I want this element to become visible and tick that that should be true. And that is how we can create an experience to update the details of a rider. Of course, I'm also going to need to create an experience that allows us to update the details of a driver. And before I add another group on my page to store the fields where a driver can update their details, I'm actually just going to click on the overall page itself, head to the layout here, and just update the minimum height to be 1000. And now on our page, we have some space to add in an additional group. So I'm going to head down to my containers menu. I'm going to add another group on our page here. I'll be calling this group driver, because this is going to be storing the information for those users registered as drivers in our app. I'm going to jump to my appearance tab here, and I'm going to choose to remove the style of this group. I'll update the background color to be a flat color, and I'll keep it as white. I'll set the roundness of the borders to be 10, like our group above it there. And then under our layout tab, I'm once again going to set the container layout to be a column, because I'll be stacking items from top to bottom. For the horizontal alignment, I'm going to want that centered in the middle of my page at all times. And then I'm going to unselect this element is fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and the maximum width to be 380. I'm also going to later on set the minimum height to be 0, but because I don't have any elements within this, if I was to set that at 0, because we have this option selected here to collapse this height to the content within it, it would just collapse automatically. So I'm just going to need to add some elements in that first. The only other thing I'd like to do on this group is just set a margin of 20 around every single border of this element. And that, of course, will just ensure it doesn't touch any of the borders of our page. And now from here, what I'd like to do is add in all of the additional fields that a driver can update within their account. And I'm going to start by just adding in the profile photo and the name of this driver. And in order to streamline that process, I'm just going to select all of our previous elements that we've added within our rider group. I'm going to then click within our driver group, and I'm going to paste these elements in. And now because I've copied this across, they're still going to maintain all of the responsive settings that we had added. The only thing I will need to do is update the name of these. So this is no longer going to be the picture uploader rider. This one is going to be registered as the picture uploader driver. And so that way, when we create our workflows, I can actually differentiate between the two picture uploaders. And I'll also need to do the same for our input field here. So instead of this being the input rider name, I'd like this to be the input driver name. And that's all of the changes I'll need to make for these two fields. I'm then going to select on our white group here, and because we have some elements within this, I'm now going to set the minimum height to be 0. And so that just means this group is going to collapse to fit the height of the elements that sit within it. The next field I would like to register for a driver though is the type of vehicle that they're choosing to drive within our application. So are they just driving with a regular Uber X, or are they driving with an Uber XL? And in order to add that field, I'm first of all just going to select our heading here. I'm going to paste that in. I'm going to move this to the next position within our group, and I'm going to open up our appearance menu here, and I'm going to display the text vehicle type. I'll type that in, and then below this I would like to display a drop down menu. So I'm going to scroll on down to my input forms. I'm going to select to add in a drop down menu within our group. It will automatically be positioned at the bottom of our group here. And I'm going to have this group be called drop down driver vehicle type. And I'm going to keep this as a list of static options. And of course, you can add in whatever options you would like based on the types of vehicles that a user can choose to drive with. In my case, I'm going to just list this as an Uber X, and as the second entry, I'm just going to write Uber XL. If, for instance, you're building an application where users can use things like scooters or motorcycles as well as cars, you can just add in whatever options you would like here. I'm just going to keep mine pretty simple for the sake of our tutorial today though. What I will also do though is just set a default value of this drop-down field. So once a user has in fact saved their vehicle type within our application, I just want to set the default value of this to be the stored value in our database. So I'm going to insert dynamic data and display the current users, their vehicle type. And of course, if there is no vehicle type stored for this user in our database, it's not going to display an option. But once they have saved that information, it's going to display that within our drop-down menu. The other thing I'd like to point out is that because we've copied our picture uploader and our existing input element across, the initial content has also copied across as well, so we won't need to make any changes to that. The thing I would like to change for our drop-down menu though is just the layout style. So I'm going to unselect that this element has a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0. I'll keep the height of this element to be fixed because I'm happy with the height of it. I will just need to add in 10 pixels of margin to the left and 10 to the right. And then from here, I'm only going to add in 2 additional input fields for our driver users. And that will just allow them to store what the model of their car is, as well as the registration plate for that car. And so in order to streamline that, I'm going to select my heading as well as my input field. I'm going to make a copy of those. I'm going to move these down to be the last position within my group here. Might just need to make that the previous option there. And this heading here will need to display the word car model. So I'm just going to remove the existing text, type in the new option. I'm then going to select on my input field, and I'm going to update the name of this to be called driver car model. And then for the initial text, I'm going to display the current user's car model. So once they've stored an entry in our database, it will automatically be displayed. And then I'm going to make one last copy of this heading as well as the input field. I'll head to my layout tab so I can just move that down on our page there. And so I'm going to want this heading here to display the word number plate. So I'm going to backspace the existing text and type that in. And then finally for the input field, I'm going to update the name of this to be called driver number plate. And then when it comes to the initial content, I'll be displaying the current user's number plate stored within our database. And then finally, the very last element I would like to add within this group is just a button element that just allows them to once again save their details within our database. I can see I'm just going to need to expand my overall page down a tad first. So I'm going to click on my gray page here. I'll head to the layout tab, and just for the sake of this, I'm going to make it 1300 pixels high. I've then just got a bit more space that I can work with, and of course I can update that later on when I publish my application. But I'm just going to add in a button element within our driver group here, and this is just going to display the words save details. I'm going to head to my layout tab here. I will center that horizontally in the middle of our group. I will then just add 20 pixels of margin at the top and 20 pixels at the bottom, just so it's spaced out evenly there. And then I'm going to create a new workflow every single time the Save Details button is clicked. So I'm going to choose to start edit a workflow. I'm going to first of all head to our data tab, because similar to our previous workflow, I'm going to want to make changes to the user's account. So I'm going to choose the make changes to a thing option. The thing I'd like to change is, of course, the current user logged into their settings page. And now I'm just going to need to change all of the relevant driver fields within our database here. So first of all, I'm going to start with the profile photo field here. I'd like this to be the same value as the picture uploader driver field, not the picture uploader writer input field. So I'm going to select the right option there, its value. Then I'll be storing the name of this user. I'd like this to be the input driver name field. Then there was the vehicle type. I would like this to equal the value of our drop-down vehicle type. And then finally, there were two more fields. There was our car model field. I want this to be the value of the input car model, which is at the top here, its value. And then finally, there was the number plate. I want this to be the value of the input number plate field in our group. And I apologize if I've just raced through those, but essentially you just need to match all of the input fields on your page with the relevant field within our database. And then of course what I'd like to do is just display our success alert message again once the details have been updated in our account. So I'm going to choose to add one last step to this workflow, head to our element actions, and just choose to display our updated success alert message. The very last thing I'll need to do on this page is just head to my design tab and click on the overall driver group here. And I'm just going to need to create a condition that only allows this group to be displayed to those users who are in fact registered as drivers, not riders. So if I head to my layout tab here, I'm going to unselect that this element is visible on page load. I'm going to collapse this element's height when it's hidden. I'm then going to head to my conditional tab here, and I'm going to recognize when the current user their profile type is, and I'm going to type in the word driver, ensuring that I have the exact same spelling here as I did on my user registration page. And then I'm going to select that this element is visible and tick that that should be true. And just like that, that is how we can create a user settings page that creates two entirely different experiences for the different types of users who have registered accounts within our application. What I'd like to do though now is just take a preview at what this whole experience looks like from the perspective of the account that I had previously just created in our last module. And in order to just quickly log into this page as that existing account that we had created, what I can do is actually head over to our data tab here and open up our app data. And then if I was to select the all users option, I can see the existing account that I had previously created. And if I choose the run as option, it's not only going to open up the page that I was viewing within my Bubble editor, but it's also going to log me in as that account. And so what you'll see now is that by default, because I'm displaying the initial content of my name within this field, it's automatically pulled that data and displayed it from our database. What I'd like to do while I'm here is just upload a profile photo. And then once I've added in those details here, I can choose to save that information and my alert message will run. And then if I would like to, let's say, add a credit card onto my file, I'm going to click our second button here. It's going to trigger that workflow that's going to redirect us through to our Stripe portal. And now what you'll see is that we are viewing this portal page within our development preview, which means you can also add in a test credit card if you would like. And if you're processing fake transactions within Stripe in your development preview, you're actually able to use a fake credit card that Stripe provides. They have a long list on their website if you'd like to use a particular card. You can just Google search dummy Stripe credit cards. But just from memory, the credit card number is 4242 recurring. And then for the expiry date, it can just be any date within the future. And then the CVC number is any three numbers. For the name on the card, I'm just going to set this as test user for the time being. And then we're going to choose to save those card details within my account. It's then going to redirect me back through to my settings page. It will then notify me that my card details have been updated. And now that condition I've added on my text and my button is being activated. So you can see that they have both been updated accordingly. And now that is just a preview of this page as a user who's registered as a rider. Of course, if you'd like, I'd recommend just taking the time to create a separate account as a user who is a driver. And of course, one thing I'd also like to point out, as you can see in the preview here, is that this page is completely responsive on mobile devices. And even on desktop, if I was to reduce the width of this page, you can see it's completely responsive within my browser. Back in my Notion checklist, I'm going to check off that we've finished building out all of the features within our settings page. There were quite a few involved within this particular module in our tutorial, but as I mentioned at the beginning, I just wanted to go through everything you need to know in as much detail as I possibly could. The next feature I wanted to focus on within our build is probably one of the most frequently used features within the Uber application. And that is building out the home page where users can input their pickup and drop off location, as well as have a pre-vetted price determined for the amount that their trip will cost in advance. And these are all features that we can easily replicate within Bubble. And so one thing I will point out is that there is quite a bit within this particular module. So if you find yourself getting lost at any point in time, like I always recommend, take the time to pause the tutorial and rewatch any sections that don't make sense the first time around. But what I want to do is jump over into my Bubble application here, and I'm going to create a brand new page from scratch. So I'm going to head to my page drop-down menu here. I'm going to choose to add a new page, and I'll be calling this my home page. And then on my homepage, the very first thing I'm going to do is just update this page to the new Flexbox responsive engine. So I'm going to choose to upgrade this page. And once my page has been upgraded to the Flexbox responsive engine, the very first thing we're going to do is just upgrade the background color to be a light shade of gray for the time being. And this is just going to allow me to see where any elements lie on it, as well as where it sits in relation to my overall canvas. When it comes to the layout of this page, I would like to build this page from top to bottom. So the container layout will of course be a column. And then for the preset page width, I want this set to be a mobile because we'll be building for a mobile device. And so now the width of our UI builder will be 380 pixels. But of course, when we start adding elements onto the page, I'm going to be explaining how we can make all of those responsive throughout that process. And now the very first elements I'd like to add onto my page are two search fields, in which I'm going to automatically pull a user's current location, and then also give the option for a user to put in a destination location. So if I scroll on down to our input forms here, you'll see an option to add in a search box element. And the reason I'm using a search box element is because under our choices style here, we have the option to reference geographical addresses. And what that'll essentially do is just integrate nicely with Google Maps, just so we can input a legitimate address into this field. I'm also going to update the name of this field to be called search box pickup location. And then for the default value of this field, I want to automatically pull the current user's location. And that'll just save them having to input that manually. So for the default value of this field, I want this to be the current geographic position of the user who is logged in and is using this application. And once we've added this search field into our page, I'm going to head to our layout tab here and just update some of the layout configurations. I'm going to want this search box positioned in the center of my page at all times. I'm then going to unselect that this element should be fixed width and set the minimum width of this search box to be 0. And then because I have a maximum width of infinite, it's automatically just going to scale to whatever size it's required to be based on the browser's current dimensions. One thing I would like to do though is just add some margin on both sides. So if I was to set a margin of 20 on the left and a margin of 20 on the right, you'll now see that regardless of the page dimensions, this search box is never going to touch the edge of the page borders. I'm also going to add in 30 pixels of margin from the top of the page just to add some space there. And for the height of this element, I'm just going to keep this fixed because 45 pixels is quite a good height for the size of this input field. If I was to jump back into my UI builder though, I'm going to copy this search field, paste in another version of it, only this time I'm going to update the name of this to be called search box destination location. And then for the choice of style, this is also going to be a geographical place, but I'm going to now remove the default value here because I want this field to be blank, because of course this is where the user will input their destination address. And then if I jump back over to my layout tab of my new search field here, I won't need to make any changes to the width or height of this element. The only thing I'm going to change is just the top margin. I'm going to set that as 10, not 30. And if I wanted, I could even jump over to my appearance tab and update the placeholder text to display the words where to ? And essentially placeholder text is just the text that will be displayed in this element until a user clicks in it, in which case that text will then disappear, unlike a default value which permanently puts that value inside that field. But once I've finished adding both of these search box fields onto my page, what I'd like to do is display a map on this page, which once two addresses have been added, I would like to draw a route between both of those locations on the map, just to show that that is the direction that the user will be traveling in. And so in this instance, I'm not going to use the default map element that Bubble has provided. Instead, I'm just going to be using a free plugin. So if I head over to my plugins tab here, I'm going to choose to add a plugin. And the plugin we'll be adding is called Maps Extended. And then I'll be installing the free Google Maps extended plugin. And the reason why I'm using this plugin is because it's essentially going to allow me to draw that visual route between the two location addresses. And now at this point, I won't need to configure any API keys within this plugin directly. Later on, I will be explaining how we will need to configure our own Google Maps API keys. But for the time being, if I jump back into my design tab here, I'm going to now scroll on down to the element here called Maps Extended. I'm going to add this onto the page, and I'm going to start by configuring the central location I'd like this map to display once the page is loaded. I will set that location to be, once again, the current geographic position of the user. And then I'm going to set the zoom rate to be 10. And from here, I'm then going to need to update the layout style of this element. And unfortunately, at this point in time, you don't have the ability to change the custom width and height of plugin elements like we do with the new responsive engine on any other element on the page. So what I'm going to do is just manually configure the width of this element to be 340 pixels and then the height to be 340 pixels. And now the reason why I've chosen 340 is because if I center the horizontal alignment of this element, because our page is 380 pixels, and now I've set this element to be 340, there's going to be 20 pixels on each side that I can add as margin. So I'm going to add 20 pixels on the left and then 20 pixels on the right. And that'll also just ensure that this map element doesn't touch the border of my page here. I'm also going to add 20 pixels of margin at the top, so it's positioned away from both of my search fields there. And now what I'd like to do is create an experience that registers when two address entries have been added into both of our search boxes, in which case I would then like to draw a route on our Google extended map here, just to indicate where this user will be traveling. And so in order to do that, I'm going to need to jump over into my workflow editor and create a custom workflow trigger here. And for this workflow trigger, I'm going to be recognizing when a condition is true. I would like to automatically trigger a new workflow. And essentially, I only want a route to be drawn on this map when both of these search fields here have a value within them. And so within our condition, I'm just going to recognize when both of our search fields are not empty. So if I jump to my workflow editor, I'm going to create a condition here that recognizes when, first of all, our pickup location search box, when its value is not empty, and when our pickup destination search box, when its value is also not empty, meaning that we now have two addresses. What I'd like to do is type in the word maps, and then I'm going to select the directions on a maps extended plugin option. And now I'll just need to configure what the origin address will be, which of course is going to be our search box pickup location, its value, and then our destination address will be the search box destination's value. And now what I'd love to do is actually just show you a quick preview of how this now looks on our page. But before we can do that, we're actually going to need to configure our own Google Maps API keys. Just because by default, what you'll notice is that within your bubble editor, you currently have two issues here that need to be fixed. And that is that within Bubble, you need to add in your own geocode API key, as well as your Google Map API key. And what that'll do is allow you to just perform as many searches as you would like for geographic addresses. And then of course be able to display those within our Maps Extended plugin here. And what you'll find is that if you head into the settings of your application and open up the General tab, you'll be able to scroll on down to the field where Bubble requires you to add in two API keys. And now I'm just going to brush over how you can source these API keys here today, because if you click this link here to the Bubble documentation, they've actually created a full video and written guide that explains how you can source your API keys. And I think this is actually a great guide that explains everything you need to know. So it'll explain how you can create a Google developer account, and it also lists the types of API services you'll need to enable within your account. One thing I will point out is that because we're using the Google Maps extended plugin, not just the standard bubble map element, you will need to enable an additional API service. And I am just going to quickly show you how you can do that. So once you've finished watching the video tutorial from Bubble here, you would have enabled all of these different API services. In your Google Developer Dashboard though, you'll just need to type in one last API service, which is called the Directions API. And this is essentially going to allow you to draw out a map route on the Maps Extended plugin. So I'm going to type in the word directions, head to the Directions API here, and then once this API has loaded, all you'll need to do is just enable this API service. And I've just jumped ahead and enabled this within my application. And so what I'd like to do now is head back over into my Bubble application, and I'd like to take a preview just to show you how this Maps Extended plugin is actually going to function. Over on my homepage here, as you can see, it's currently pulling my geographical address and it's displaying a quick overview of the location on my map here. And at this point in time, it has automatically also pulled through my address into my very first search bar. But let's say if I would like to add in a destination address here, I'm just going to type in an address. And what you'll see is our workflow will now run and it's going to draw a direction on our map between the two locations. And this is essentially just a preview of what the maps experience will look like for your end users. Of course, I'm previewing this on desktop for the time being, but I'll be showing you in a moment what this looks like on a mobile device. And from here, what I also want to do is just take the time to explain how we can now create a pricing algorithm that allows users to be presented with pricing options based on the different Uber vehicle types, which of course they can then choose from when they want to book and create this trip. And so in order to create a pricing algorithm, the first thing I'm going to do is display two different options on my homepage, one for each of the different styles of vehicles that a user can book within our platform. So today I'm just going to be showing you the example of an Uber X or an Uber XL. As I've mentioned in previous modules, you could have something like different forms of transport, like scooters or motorbikes. But in order to display both options, what I'm going to do is select to add a group element onto the bottom of my page here. And I'm going to update the name of this to be called Group Price. And I will remove the style of this group for the time being, just so I can update the background color to be a flat color. And I'll have this just be a light shade of red, so I can just see where it actually sits on my overall page. And then when it comes to the layout of this group, I want this to be a column container layout because I'll be stacking items in this from top to bottom. I'm also going to want to horizontally align this in the center of my page. And then I'm going to need to update the height and width settings here to make this group fully responsive. So I'm going to start by unselecting that this element is fixed width on our page. I'm then going to set the minimum width to be 0 and the maximum width to be infinite. So now, regardless of the size of this page, this group is going to be responsive at all times. I'm then going to leave the minimum height at 250 for now. I will be coming back and setting this to be 0 once I've added some elements within this space. But while I'm here, what I'm also going to be doing is adding in a top margin of 20 pixels so it sits away from my map element on the page. And then I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin on the left, 20 pixels on the right, and 20 pixels at the bottom. And what that's going to do is just ensure that regardless of the size of this group, it's never going to touch the borders of my page. And then essentially within this group here, I'm going to add in 2 additional groups. And this is going to display both of the vehicle types that a user can choose between, as well as the different prices for these vehicles. And so I'm going to start by adding in a group within my existing group here. And I'm going to be calling this first group Uber X. I'm going to jump to my Appearance tab here, and I'm going to remove the style of this group. I'll set the background style to be a flat color. And then while we're here, I'm going to set the roundness of the borders for this group to be 10. And now after I've set the roundness of the borders here, I'm going to head to the layout menu and I'm going to set the layout of this to be a row. Because within this group, I'm only going to want to display 2 elements horizontally next to each other. So I'm not going to want to stack those vertically. What I'm going to be displaying is an image of this vehicle type, as well as an input field, which will display a price forecast for this trip option. And while I'm working on our layout tab here, I'm also just going to start making some of the settings here responsive. And so for the horizontal alignment of this group, I want it to be centered. I'm going to unselect that this element is fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, and then the maximum width to be infinite. And because it sits within my overall red group, it's never going to breach the borders of that parent element. When it comes to the height, I'm going to be setting that to be 0 in a moment. But what I'd like to do is now add the elements into this group that I'd like to display. And the first, as I mentioned, is just going to be an image element. And I want this to display a static image that I have stored on my local device here. And in this case, I just have a photo of an UberX vehicle here that I'm going to be using. I'm going to head to my layout menu here. And then when it comes to the vertical alignment of this element, I want it to be centered in the middle of my white group. I'm going to then also update the width of this to be 70 pixels. And I'm going to select to keep this aspect ratio fixed. So I'm going to have it 1:1, which will make it a perfect square. And then beside the image of this vehicle, I'm going to display the title of this vehicle. So as I mentioned in this case, it's going to be an UberX. So I'm going to choose to add a text element into my group, and this will just display the word UberX. I'll open up my rich text editor here. I'll highlight that. I'll choose to bold the formatting of it. And then going to jump over to my layout tab here. I'll vertically align that in the center, just so it's centered with my image there. I'm going to unselect that this element has a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite. So that way it just scales based on how much space it has within our white group. We'll also set the minimum height to be 0, so that way it fits nicely around the text within this element. And then I'm just going to add 10 pixels of margin to the left, just so that way this text element doesn't touch our image there. And then finally, the very last element I'd like to add within our white group is actually going to be an input field. So if we scroll on down to our input forms, I'm going to choose to add in an input field here. And what you'll see is because the text element here has a minimum width of 0 and a maximum width of infinite, it's going to collapse based on how much space this input field now needs. And for this input field here, I'm going to update the name of this to be called input price UberX. And as you probably guessed, this input field is going to be used to display a price forecast of this particular Uber vehicle. And now the reason why I've chosen to add in an input field, not a text element, is because when I need to reference the price forecast within a workflow, I'm going to need to actually pull a stored value from an input field. I just wouldn't be able to reference a text element itself. And I'd also like to update the content format of this input field to be a currency. So that way it's going to display a dollar amount. What I'd also like to do is select this option here to disable this input, which just means that users won't be able to make any changes to the number that's displayed within this field. And then if you'd really like, what you could do is even remove the style of this input and just remove all of its borders so that way it doesn't look like an actual input field. If you just remove the border and set the background color to be none, what you'll find is that this is now just going to look like a standard text element. I'll also just position the text within this input field to the right hand side. And so as you can see, the actual input field itself isn't as visible now. But what I want to do before I actually configure the layout settings of this input field is just explain how we can create our own pricing algorithm that just structures what pricing amount is to be listed within this field for an UberX. And the way you can do that is by calculating the distance between the pickup location and the drop-off location. And then you can perform a calculation on that to determine what price you'd like to charge for, let's say, different distances. And so for the initial content that I would like to display within this field, I'm going to first of all recognize the search box destination location its value, and then I'm going to identify the distance from the original search field. So I'm going to set the distance from the search box pickup location, its value, and then I'm personally going to set the unit here to be in metric, so I'm going to choose kilometers. And now that I've calculated the distance between these two addresses, what I can then do is perform a calculation to determine how much I'm going to charge per kilometer. And so let's say there is 10 kilometers in distance between both of our pickup and drop-off location. What I could do is then select the multiplication formula here and then type in something like 1.5. So that just means that for every kilometer, it's going to charge the user $1.5, so $1.50, which just means if they were to travel 10 kilometers, it's going to charge them $15. And now that's how you can create an initial pricing structure. But of course, every distance will most likely have a different pricing structure. So for instance, if a user was to travel less than, let's say, 5 kilometers, you might just want to charge them a flat rate. And if a user was to travel further than 100 kilometers, you might want to charge them a lower rate because they're going to be paying more for the overall trip. And so what you can do to create a dynamic pricing algorithm is just add a list of conditions onto this input field here. So by default, our pricing structure is going to charge the user at a 1.5 multiple for every kilometer, so $1.50 per kilometer. What I'd like to do though is head over to my condition tab here and define a new condition. And I'd first of all just like to recognize if the user is traveling less than 5 kilometers, in which case I'd like to just charge them a flat rate of, let's say, $20. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to recognize when the search box destination location, its value, when its distance from our original search box, so the search box pickup location, its value, when the distance in kilometers is, in this case, less than 5, so when it's less than 5 kilometers, what I'm going to want to do is set the initial content of our input field here to now just be a flat number, in which case I can just set that to be 20. So now that's going to charge $20. But now let's say if a user was to travel a further distance, what I'd like to do is instead of charging them at $1.50 per kilometer, I'd like to charge them at 75 cents per kilometer. So I'm going to add yet another condition within our conditional tab here. I'm going to define a new condition, and I'm going to recognize when the search box destination location, when its value here, when its distance from our original search box, so our search box pickup location, its value, when the kilometers in difference is greater than 100, what I'd like to do is identify how many kilometers are being traveled, and then I'm going to multiply that by 0.75. So 75 cents per kilometer. And so in order to do that, I'm going to then head to our behavior for our conditional tab here. I will identify the initial content, and I'm going to need to perform a calculation once again. And because this is a dynamic price, I'm going to need to recognize once again the destination search box, its value, its distance from our origin search box, so the pickup location, its value, the distance in kilometers, and then I'm going to multiply this distance. So I'm going to scroll on down to the multiplication formula, and I'm going to multiply that by 0.75. So now the user is going to be charged at 75 cents per kilometer. And that is just a small example of how you can create your own different pricing algorithm. Of course, if you'd like to charge users for different prices at different distances, you can just experiment and play around with all of the different conditional logic here. But for the time being for our tutorial today, I'm happy with just showing you a couple of examples there. Because what I'd like to do now is jump over into my layout tab so I can finish off structuring the format of this input field. I'm going to choose to center the vertical alignment here, and then I'm going to unselect this element is fixed with. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite, and then I'm going to leave the height of this input field to be fixed, in which now that I've finished formatting all of the elements within our overall white group here, I'm going to head to the layout tab within my parent group. I'm going to set the minimum height here to be 0. And now you'll see, because we have the option selected to fit the height of this group to the elements that sit within it, it's going to collapse nicely around those. The last thing I would like to do within this group is just make a copy of our existing group here, because I also want to be able to price a user based on a different form of transport, and that is an Uber XL, not just an Uber X. And so for our group here, I'm going to start by updating the name of this to be called Group Uber XL. I'm going to then select on our image within this group, and I'm going to upload a different static image from my device here. As you can see, I just have a separate image saved here that displays an image of an Uber XL. I'm then going to click on the title text here, and I'm just going to type in the Uber XL text. And then when it comes to the pricing field here, I'm going to update the name of this to be called Price Uber XL. And then because I'd like to charge more for an Uber XL here, I could, let's say, set the price per kilometer to be $1.90. And then when it comes to our conditional prices, I could also change these. So I could say that the flat price for anything lower than 5 kilometers is $25. And then if a user is traveling more than 100 kilometers, I could set the price per kilometer here to be, let's say, 90 cents. And that's how you can quickly update the different pricing algorithm there. What I would like to do is just click on my main white group here, head to my layout tab, because I just want to add 10 pixels of margin at the top here, so that way it's separated from my existing UberX group. And then below both of our groups here, I'm just going to add in a button element into our group, which will just prompt the user to trigger a workflow when they're ready to book a particular ride within our application. And so within this button here, I'm just going to display the words confirm Uber X. And so by default, it's going to assume that a user is going to want to book the cheaper option. Of course, we'll be creating a condition in a moment that will allow us to update this text if a user selects on the Uber XL option. But for the time being, I'm just going to head to our layout tab here and choose to align this button in the center of my red group. I'm also going to unselect that this element is fixed width, set the minimum width to be 0, the maximum width to be infinite, so that way it stretches all across the space it has in our red group. And then I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin at the top of this button here. And then because that's the very last element I would like to add into my overall red group, I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to set the minimum height of that group to now be 0, which means it's going to collapse around all of the elements there. And the very last thing I want to build out on my homepage is just a way to, as I mentioned before, update the text that's displayed within my button. So if a user clicks on the group here to book an UberX, I obviously want to display the word UberX. If a user wants to book an Uber XL though, once they click on this group, I want to display the words confirm Uber XL. And the way I'm going to build this out is going to be detrimental when it comes to actually registering the vehicle type within the workflow that creates a trip in our database. And the way I am going to be doing that is by using what's called a custom state in Bubble. And so if you've never used custom states before, what they are is essentially just a way to temporarily store data on your page without having to store it in your database. And so what I want to do is create a custom state on my page that just registers what type of vehicle a user would like to book within their Uber trip. And in order to create a custom state, what you'll need to do is actually just click on the overall page here. And if you head to the information icon, you'll see an option here to create a new state. And for the name of this state, I'm just going to be calling this vehicle type. And this is just going to allow me to register what type of vehicle a user would like to book. I'm going to set the type of state here to just be a text type. I'll create that. And then I'm going to set the default value to be UberX. So as I mentioned before, we're going to assume that by default, a user is going to want to book the cheaper option, which is the UberX. And then what we're going to do is create a workflow that changes the value of this state when, let's say, the UberXL group is clicked here. And then based on the overall custom state, I want the text of my button to reflect what value is currently being stored. And so I'm going to click on my UberXL group here. And I'm going to head to my Appearance tab and choose to create a workflow whenever this group is clicked. And within this workflow, I'm going to type in the word state, and I'm going to want to set the state of an element. The element I'll be setting the state of is our overall home page, and the custom state will be the only state we've created, which is the vehicle type. In this case, I'm going to want to set the value of this to be UberXL, so I'm just going to manually type in that text. And then while we're here, I'm also going to create a workflow that can also revert the state back to UberX if the UberX group is clicked. So I'm going to select the white UberX group here. I'm going to choose to start edit a workflow when this is clicked. And in this case, I'm going to type in the word state once again. And the element I'll be setting the state of is our home page. The custom state is our vehicle type. And in this case, I'm going to be setting the value as UberX. And then finally, what I can do in my design tab is click on my button element here, head to my condition tab, and I'm just going to recognize when the state of our home page, when its value is set to UberXL, I'm going to want to display the words confirm UberXL, not just confirm UberX. So I'm going to scroll on down to the home page option here, and I'm going to recognize when the home page, when it's vehicle type custom state, when it is currently UberXL, I'm going to update the text that's displayed here to now display the word confirm UberXL. And of course, I can toggle that on and on to see how that's going to behave. And what this also just means is that when the state is anything but UberXL, this button's just going to refer back to the option which just displays the word confirm UberX. And that is the very last thing that I want to change on my page for the time being. In a separate module, I'm going to be explaining how we can actually create the workflows to book a trip within our ride-sharing application. And after configuring this condition, we're very close to being able to preview our work within this module here. The very last thing I want to do is just create a condition on our overall red group here. So by default, this group is being displayed regardless of if a user has selected a destination address. Whereas I only want this group to be displayed once the user has in fact inputted a pickup address as well as a destination address, in which case I'm then going to display them the option to see the prices as well as then confirm that they want to book that trip. And so within our red group here, I'm going to first of all unselect that this element is visible on page load. I'm then going to choose to collapse this element's height when it's hidden. And then under our conditional tab here, I'm going to define a condition that just recognizes when it should be allowed to be displayed. And in this case, I'm only going to want this group to be displayed when a user has added an address into both of our search box fields. So I'm going to recognize when the pickup location search box, when its value is not empty, and when the pickup destination search box, when its value is not empty, I'm going to select that this element is visible and tick that that should be true. And before I preview the actual experience of my home page, I'm just going to remove the background style of this element, so that way you no longer see the red elements on my page. And after we've updated the style of the background, I'm ready to take a preview at what this page now looks like within a preview of our Uber application. Over in a preview of our application, what you'll see is that because I'm viewing our actual homepage on a desktop device, the page has become fully responsive and it's scaled to become the full width of my desktop browser dimensions. But if I was to then also reduce the width of my page here, what you'll see is that all of the input fields and elements will scale accordingly to the width of my browser. And from here, if I was wanting to see how this page actually functions, what I could do is add in an address that I would like to travel to. So I'm just going to type in an address here. I'll say that I want to travel to a street in San Francisco. I will select that. And then our Maps Extended map will automatically lay out a route in which the Uber will travel throughout this trip. And if we were to scroll on down, what we'll also see is that we now have our price comparisons between our Uber and our Uber XL here. And of course, by default, our button here will confirm that we want to book the cheaper option of an Uber X. But if I was to click on our second group here, the custom state will automatically update in our page. And now it'll display that we want to confirm a booking for an Uber XL. If I was to once again just reduce the width of my browser here, what you'll see is that all of the elements within this group are completely responsive. And if I was to also add a preview of how this page looks like from a mobile device, you'll also see that every single element on this page fits nicely within the size of my mobile screen. And that's just because on all of the elements, we're taking the time to set the minimum width to be 0 and also set the maximum width to be infinite, which just means that any element that we add onto the page is of course going to scale to the size of the current user's device. Back on my Notion doc here, I'm just going to check off that we've finished building out all of the features for our home page, which as you could see, there was quite a few things that I wanted to cover throughout this module, but I just wanted to be sure to explain everything in as much detail as you possibly needed in order to make this whole experience as simple as possible. And that is all I have time for in this tutorial today. If you were interested in checking out the rest of the course, I'd recommend clicking the link in the description to purchase the full course. Within the complete course, I'll be walking you through the step-by-step instructions to complete the rest of our build. You can also get access to a suite of Bubble tutorials where you'll learn how to build other popular products. If you'd like to get started building some other popular products for free, I'll be sure to include some suggested links at the end of this video. Thanks again for taking the time to watch, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see any other useful tutorials to help you on your Bubble journey.